For our next conversation, please welcome Richard Hovhannisyan Endowed Chair of Modern Armenian History at UCLA, Dr. Sebouh Aslanian, and Visiting Professor of Global Studies at Hamline University, Dr. Artyom Tonoyan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be here on the same stage as my friend and colleague Artyom Tonoyan to discuss a very important topic as a kind of continuation of the last two excellent panels. One that was an honors class, or whatever the expression is, I forget now, but one that was a real master class on the importance of narrative, surfeit of narrative, too much narrative, too little narrative, and its relationship to agency and so forth, and sovereignty. And of course, another brilliant presentation by Simon Marakian that offers us plenty of context for us to continue with this session. So today's session will be I'm going to be posing a number of questions. We're going to be posing 2 questions for each one of us. And I will begin by saying a few words of context in terms of what this panel seeks to do. So, of course, I want to once again congratulate Wen and Eric Nazarian for their brilliant discussion on narrative. And I think our conversation will be picking up where the earlier ones left off. So I'll begin by saying this much about the context. So from Ernest Renan's celebrated Sorbonne lecture of 1882, Qu'est-ce qu'une nation? What is a nation? To Eric Hobsbawm's more recent work on nationalism, the role of historians and their craft in engineering and in engendering and legitimating ethnic conflicts and cleansings around the world has been a commonly accepted fact, even if it has not been properly scrutinized. The profession of history and its practitioners have often been at the forefront or in the trenches of ethnic conflicts and cleansings from the Balkans to the former Soviet Union. In Hobsbawm's memorable phrase from a 1994 article, and I quote, "Historians are to nationalism what poppy growers in Pakistan are to heroin addicts. We supply the essential ingredients," is what he says. So he says, we supply the raw material for the market. Nations without a past are contradictions in terms. What makes a nation is the past. What justifies one nation against others is the past. And historians are the people who produce it, unquote. In few other regions of the world, perhaps, have historians been as complicit in engendering ethnic and territorial conflict as in the South Caucasus, home to the Armenians, Georgians, Azerbaijani Turks, and a host of smaller communities. Historians' pivotal role in such conflicts was most visibly demonstrated in the 44-day war over Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh and the ethnic cleansing that culminated last year. After all, at the center of this conflict is the history of an otherwise obscure, enigmatic kingdom known as Caucasian Albania, not to be confused with the state in Europe, in the Balkans, and its relationship with the region's Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Though they disappeared from history around the 8th or 9th century CE, the Caucasian Albanians and their arcane history were resuscitated by Azerbaijani historians and others during the 20th century to lay claims to the history and cultural patrimony of the disputed enclave of Artsakh. Were the Albanians the ancestral forerunners of the Azeri nation, and are Karabakh's historical monuments, including ancient cathedrals and majestic churches, part of the patrimony of the Albanians and therefore of the Azeri nation, as Azeri historians claim, or was the area under dispute always part of historic Armenia, and the local Armenians in the area in the area as the indigenous population, as claimed by the Armenian historians. So, my first question to Artyom has to do with setting this up, and by reminding us, perhaps, that we have to begin our discussion with the elephant in the room in some ways, or in the hall, and that is the former Soviet Union, and on the role of Soviet nationality policy in the construction of such myths and in the propagation of ideologies of hatred and intolerance. So, as someone who has studied the peculiarities of Soviet history, can you tell us, Artyom, in a few words, about why Soviet nationality policy, including its various stages, were not just an important part of understanding, the current realities in the South Caucasus, but also can help us really understand how conflict was shaped and created, constituted by a certain set of practices that defined the Soviet Union as a unique kind of federated ethnic national state.
Sure. Thank you, Sebouh, for your masterful introduction. Any graduate students take notes how to do a proper introduction for your papers. And I'll try to do a graduate seminar in 5 minutes about Soviet nationalities policies, which is quite complex, but I'll try to boil it down for you in a Reader's Digest version. I'm not sure if the young people know what the Reader's Digest is, but your grandparents probably do. Give them a hug. So the Soviet nationalities policy is a very important topic in trying to understand the origins of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In what way? Well, the Soviet Union, as you may have imagined, and some of us have experienced, was a rather large political entity that incorporated 15 republics and dozens of autonomous republics and autonomous oblasts. And it was, as you can imagine, as an imperial Russian legacy, rather difficult to manage. It incorporated not only these republics, but it also incorporated hundreds of ethnic groups and nationalities with their different historical origins and different historic trajectories. And the Soviet Union had to come up with a solution on how to control and to manage this rather cumbersome project that Lenin, Stalin, and etc. undertook with the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. So how did they go about managing the Soviet Union? Well, one of the most important political practices that they implemented was something called korenizatsiya in Russian, or indigenization in English. It meant that, you know, the Soviet Empire is, the Russian Empire is gone, and in order to control the local populations and in order to co-opt the local elites, you had to find talent from within that ethnic group. Let's say in Armenia, you find an Armenian talent, in Russia, in Ukraine, of course, Ukrainian or Russian talent, and in Kazakhstan, Kazakhs, local Kazakhs, who are not only familiar with the local cultural practices, but they're ensconced in it, enveloped in it, and it is easier to control the local population when the person giving command in the factory is not named Ivan, but Hovannes, right? So indigenization, you find somebody from the local area, you bestow them power, you put them through the Soviet educational system, and make sure that they are beholden to the center, and at the same time they are doing the center's bidding in controlling the local populations, suppressing certain nationalist aspirations or whatnot. The second thrust of the policy was, how do you go about doing it? Well, an enormous emphasis on education and language policies. Education was to be carried out in local languages rather than just in Russian, as in during this, the Russian Empire. And another form of control and co-optation was the encouragement of writing national history and promoting local cultures. what the Soviet Union was trying to say, that yes, we're sort of a Russian imperial project, read differently, but at the same time, we do not want to be the bulldozer that comes along and destroys your local culture, destroys your local cultural practices, your identity, your language, and so on and so forth. So the Soviet government allowed certain parameters within which the Armenians, the Azeris, the Georgians, Karakalpaks, or any number of ethnic groups could sort of engender their identities, promote it. They had all sorts of educational and cultural programs that meant to protect these cultural identities rather than completely undermine them. This becomes more pronounced under Stalin, but less and more strict rather under Stalin, when Stalin decides that the Karenization is not completely the right way to go, but under Khrushchev and under Brezhnev, this indigenization project sort of reawakens. And by the time, certainly, you get to by 1970s, the cultural practices, and I meant to say something else and I forgot, was that also the Soviet government encouraged writing local national histories. And if you can imagine, Armenians, let's say, Russians, or Armenians, Azeris, Georgians are tasked, and the historians and the Academy of Sciences are tasked in writing local histories that complement each other, sort of a Venn diagram with overlaps. By the time you get to 1970s, these writings, these historical studies become like two magnets that are repelling each other rather than an overlapping Venn diagram. And all of this comes to a head with the coming to power of Mikhail Gorbachev and the perestroika and glasnost, where previously sort of taboo national, cultural, religious practices were allowed to be entertained and discussed and voiced out. So that sort of writing of history that was in the beginning compatible and overlapped ended up becoming, actually, by 1980s, clashing histories and clashing historiographies, which then would lead to real clashes on the ground in 1980s and 1990s. I hope that sort of answered the question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So the question I have for Sebouh is written here, so I'm good at reading stuff, especially when it's written in English. Oh my gosh. My apologies. So the question I have for Sebouh is, could you please briefly discuss what Caucasian Albania was and who the Caucasian Albanians were? Why are they significant, given that the entire entity effectively ceased to exist by the 8th century? Additionally, how has their history impacted the cultural and political narrative surrounding the Karabakh conflict?
Well, maybe one way of starting this response would be to ask a different kind of a question that you asked, but slightly in a different position, and which is to say, instead of asking who are the Caucasian Albanians, perhaps we should begin by asking ourselves, who are they not? And I say this because who are they not? Because the Caucasian Albanians, an ancient esoteric peoples whose history has for the most part disappeared for the past 1,000+ years, were only recently resuscitated by the elites of Azerbaijan and in the Soviet Union by Soviet elites as well. And I think in terms of who they were not, I could say that They've been used numerous times in recent decades, especially because of conflict in the Caucasus. Their history and their usable past, their invented tradition, to use a term that Hobsbawm uses, that is a specifically selective usage of the past and a kind of a narrative history that gives the agent of that history a patina of continuity and authority and legitimacy on a piece of land. That idea of the Caucasian Albanians is something that is fairly recent. And so it's been used in Dagestan, as the scholar Murtazali Gajiev has pointed out, in terms of conflicts between Lezgis and others. It's been used in Georgia for reclaiming Georgian Christianity and Georgian Christian cathedrals and so on. And it's been also used, as Simon mentioned earlier, in, of all places, on the island of Akhtamar, places which have absolutely no relation to the real or imagined history of the Caucasian Albanians. So the Caucasian Albanians are essentially 26 tribes who were first mentioned by the Greek geographer Strabo in the 1st century BCE AD as being a loosely confederated kingdom of tribes, each with its own king, that had a territory in the 1st to 2nd century BCE, whose exact location and boundaries are far from clear. After Strabo, of course, for many years, the Caucasian Albanians also are famous are well known because they're considered one of 3 indigenous peoples in the South Caucasus, alongside the Georgians, the Armenians, and the Albanians, one of 3 indigenous peoples. In the early 4th century, they are said to have converted to Christianity. In 424 or so CE, the Armenian scribe Mashtots designed a specific script for the Caucasian Albanian language, a script that many people doubted existed until 1937, when a Georgian scholar discovered in an Armenian manuscript at the Madenataran 52 letters of the original Albanian script that Mashtots had crafted. And so this kind of unleashed a storm of interest on the Caucasian Albanians in 1937, after more than 1,000 years of almost complete oblivion. In 1937, a French scholar wrote a famous essay on the Albanians, Georges Dumézil, and from there onwards, the Albanians became a major source of interest for a number of people. But at the same time that their history was being resuscitated in the West, what's more important for us to consider is that in the same period, in 1937, after the declaration of the Stalin Constitution and the transformation of the Transcaucasian Soviet Federated Republic into which Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia were members of the same loosely federated region, with Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh being given to the Azerbaijani part of that federation, which still did not have its own independence until, of course, the late 1930s. So in the 1930s, Soviet authorities, led by imperatives from the Kremlin, from Stalin particularly, and guided by Soviet nationality policy and its importance, the importance that it attached to indigenous titular nationalities, that is to say nationalities that controlled a republic's sovereignty, its history, its culture, and so on, at the expense of others living there, minorities. In the 1930s, essentially, the Albanians became incorporated into the Azerbaijani national saga. Up until the 1930s, Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis were known under a variety of names, from Caucasian Tatars, and so forth, Caucasian Muslims. And so. It was only in the late 1930s that the term Azerbaijani as an ethnonym was designed, and at that time, the Caucasian Albanian narrative reared its head as a result of a number of Orientalists in Russia, and particularly Zelig Yampolsky, a Russian ethnographer who was one of the first, I believe, to claim that the Caucasian Albanians were the ancestor nation of Azerbaijan. At that time, the Azerbaijani titular nationality, by all accounts, felt that its roots were relatively recent in the region. After all, their ancestors until then were considered to have come to the region in the 11th century, 12th, 13th centuries CE, with a large wave of Oghuz Turkic migrations. And so that Turkic theory of Azerbaijani ethnic identity was shifted in the 1930s precisely for two reasons, having to do with Soviet nationality policy. One was that the Azeris, as a titular indigenous nationality, had to be distinguished and severed from others in the region that could threaten the survival of the Soviet regime, and particularly of the South Caucasus. The Turks were the first ones to be severed, and so Iranians also to the south severed, and the major concern for Azerbaijanis was to be as ancient, to have as ancient a pedigree as the Armenians and the Georgians. And precisely at that time, in the 1939, Jan Polsky essentially suggested that the proper ancestor nation for the Azerbaijani Republic, one that was indigenous and tied to the soil of Azerbaijan SSR, were the Caucasian Albanians. And from there on, in the 1960s, that whole narrative of Caucasian Albanian history as replacing Armenian history came to acquire a new direction in the 1960s, 1965, by this scholar who has a very questionable reputation for very obvious reasons, Zia Bunyatov, an unprofessional academic who delved into this area and wrote a famous book in 1965 called Azerbaijan from the 7th to the 9th centuries, in which he made a number of mind-boggling claims which essentially robbed Armenians in Artsakh of their sovereignty and memory and history, and replaced all of that, transferred it to the Azerbaijani titular nationality. So from 65 onwards, the Albanians became very closely attached to the Armenians in Karabakh, and they became the major focal point for ideological work, incitement, and a kind of surrogate ancestor state to the Azerbaijanis. That, of course, meant that Armenians who claimed the very territory and the monuments as theirs came to be seen all of a sudden as usurpers, as people who migrated very lately, in some accounts, from Azerbaijani circles. Armenians arrived there in the 19th century even, according to some of these accounts. So I would say that the Albanians are essentially a foil to be used to appropriate sovereignty from others, particularly from non-titular nationalities, as the Armenians were in Azerbaijan, and to use their history to essentially culturally appropriate their past and their memory, and to transfer that over to the titular nationality of the Azerbaijanis as the legitimate heirs of Karabakh's territory, because Azerbaijan, after all, is a continuation of Caucasian Albania.
Wow.
So, I'm all over the place.
That was as comprehensive as it gets and as concentrated as it gets. Lots of food for thought. Well, I don't think we have time to go into further detail. I'll finish it by one quote from one of my favorite American writers ever, O. Henry. If you haven't read O. Henry, I suggest highly for you to read it. And he has, when you said about this unprofessional historian, a dilettante who made essentially the waves, Zia Bunyatov, I remembered just now a quote from a short story by O. Henry. I think the short story is called The Sword of D'Artagnan. And the quote goes something like this: when a troubadour ditches his sword, when a troubadour ditches his guitar for a sword, trouble is sure to follow. And here you have a troubadour ditching his guitar for a sword. I hope lots of these swashbuckling historians that have created these false narratives and forging stories out of thin air will rather pick up their guitar instead of the swords. And I think on that note we can...
That's a very good way of ending it on a positive note. Thank you.